People who drink coffee tend to live longer, but you gain the benefits only if you consume it correctly. That's why I'm going to share the top mistakes you may be making when drinking coffee and how to get the maximum benefit, the strongest effect, the longest-term advantage from it. The first and most well-known function of coffee is that it improves alertness and cognition. It enhances attention, reaction time, and mental sharpness. When you consume caffeine, the most noticeable effect is that you feel more focused. For example, during long-distance driving or while studying, it improves attention, vigilance, mental endurance. It enhances reaction time, so you feel quicker, sharper, more responsive. Your working memory also improves. This happens because in the brain, when it uses energy and stays active, adenosine gradually accumulates. Adenosine is a molecule that binds to neurons and reduces their activity, firing rate, signal transmission. It also decreases dopamine activity, which contributes to fatigue, low drive, sleepiness. On the other hand, caffeine structurally resembles adenosine. It binds to adenosine receptors but does not activate them, effectively blocking the fatigue signal, preventing inhibition, maintaining alertness. That is why a person stays active, alert, focused, rather than tired. The effect of caffeine is stronger when you are sleep-deprived or already fatigued. If you are well-rested, caffeine still has a stimulant effect, but the impact is milder, subtler, less pronounced. And here is the first mistake people make regarding coffee. Some people drink coffee immediately after waking up. This is a mistake because of the natural cortisol rhythm. When you wake up, your body is already charged with cortisol within about 45 minutes, which increases alertness, mobilizes glucose, activates the sympathetic nervous system, and suppresses adenosine signaling. So biologically, you are already being stimulated. If you drink caffeine immediately, you are stacking stimulation on top of stimulation, and you may not get the desired effect. The opposite may happen. You may get stronger sympathetic activation and a potential afternoon crash, so you may feel energy deficiency during midday. If you consume caffeine at the peak of cortisol daily, your brain adapts and upregulates adenosine receptors, increasing baseline inhibition. As a result, you start needing caffeine just to feel normal. Your inhibition baseline becomes higher, and caffeine no longer improves performance. It only restores baseline function. This looks like tolerance, adaptation, dependence. That is why the most appropriate action is to wait around 90 minutes after waking before the first caffeine intake. Because the cortisol peak declines, adenosine begins to accumulate, and the fatigue signal starts rising. The ideal morning dosage is 1 strong cup of coffee for maximal benefit, which is about 100 to 200 milligrams of caffeine. Higher doses are usually not needed. If you have long-distance driving, take a small dose before driving, around 100 milligrams. When you consume caffeine, the noticeable effect is improved focus. For example, during long-distance driving or studying, it improves attention, reaction time, and working memory. You feel quicker, sharper, more responsive. The second most important feature of coffee is that in hundreds of thousands of people observed in large population studies, those who drink around 2 to 4 cups per day tend to live longer compared with the general population. The reason for this effect is that coffee can reduce low-grade inflammation because it contains chlorogenic acids and polyphenols. Also, caffeine is associated with a reduced risk of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, with reduced fat accumulation in the liver and with improved insulin sensitivity. Coffee even reduces the risk of liver cancer. Here we should mention one important factor. Coffee contains cafestol, a natural component of coffee that can have a cholesterol-raising effect, which may negatively affect cardiovascular health. And here is an important mistake people make. People often think the safest and most health-promoting option is boiled coffee, such as Turkish or Greek coffee. In reality, it's not exactly like this. This type of boiled coffee is indeed very high in antioxidants and relatively high in caffeine compared with many instant coffees and some machine coffees. But it is also high in cafestol, which can raise low-density lipoprotein cholesterol, often called LDL cholesterol. So it has both a positive effect and a negative effect. Regular intake of unfiltered boiled coffee can increase LDL cholesterol in a substantial portion of people who drink more than 3 cups per day. In contrast, most instant coffees have minimal effect on cholesterol, and filtered machine coffee is considered the safest option because the paper filter removes most of the cafestol. If we talk about the healthiest long-term choice, filtered coffee is generally considered the best studied, the most cardiovascular friendly, and the most appropriate for daily intake. The second best option is instant coffee, but here the main limitation is often bean quality, with typically lower caffeine content and somewhat lower antioxidant levels compared with boiled coffee. So if you consume coffee regularly, the most balanced approach is filtered coffee as the primary choice, or high-quality instant coffee when needed. The third most common mistake is that people drink coffee after 3 p.m., because after this time, in about 70% of people, it worsens sleep. Only around 10% of the population are relatively unaffected because of faster caffeine metabolism. The problem is that during the day, adenosine builds up in the brain, creating sleep pressure and a sense of tiredness. Caffeine blocks adenosine receptors, reducing this sleep signal. The half-life of caffeine is around 6 hours, sometimes 7 hours, and in some people, even 10 hours, depending on genetics, liver metabolism, and hormonal factors. It also delays melatonin release by about 40 minutes. Caffeine reduces deep sleep by roughly 20% and lowers overall sleep efficiency. Some people can drink coffee at night and still fall asleep. This group is around 20 to 30% of the population. It often happens when a person is already sleep-deprived, physically exhausted, or stressed, when adenosine levels are extremely high and caffeine cannot fully override sleep pressure. But here is an important point. They may fall asleep quickly, yet deep sleep is still reduced. Some individuals have fast caffeine metabolism and can drink coffee even 3 hours before sleep without obvious difficulty, because in them, the caffeine half-life may be closer to 3 hours. Also, people with heavy daily caffeine consumption develop more adenosine receptors, so subjective stimulation decreases, and they may fall asleep more easily again. The practical advice is to consume caffeine earlier in the day. Coffee before 3 p.m. is ideal for most people, or at least about 8 hours before sleep, to protect sleep quality, deep sleep, and recovery. And the fourth mistake is consuming more than 4 cups of coffee per day, because the safest dosage for most healthy adults, for about 90% of the population, is considered around 400 milligrams of caffeine, which equals roughly 4 cups per day. The problem is that when you consume too much coffee, caffeine chronically blocks adenosine receptors, and the nervous system stays activated, stimulated, on edge. Over time, these receptors upregulate, baseline fatigue rises, tolerance forms, and you need more caffeine to feel the same effect. You start to feel worse without it, so a kind of dependence develops. It is usually not a severe physiological dependence, but it is still a real functional dependence. Excessive caffeine intake also causes sustained nervous system activation. It increases adrenaline, norepinephrine, and cortisol levels, raises heart rate, elevates blood pressure, and can make a person feel more anxious. These effects are more likely when intake exceeds about 4 cups per day. Around 4 cups already produce measurable sympathetic activation in roughly 60% of people. Increased dopamine signaling can contribute to anxiety, restlessness, and irritability, and at higher doses people often feel jittery, overstimulated, unable to relax. More than 400 milligrams per day may cause mild palpitations or noticeable tachycardia in about 10% of people, usually due to increased adrenaline. This is more common in people with anxiety disorders, low magnesium levels, or genetic slow caffeine metabolism. A short-term rise in blood pressure can occur, typically modest and not prolonged, but in caffeine-sensitive individuals the increase may be more noticeable because of adrenaline release. Drinking more than 4 cups of coffee is also strongly associated with sleep problems. Intake above about 400 milligrams can lead to dependence in nearly 50% of people, with withdrawal symptoms when they stop, headache, fatigue, low mood, poor focus. This happens because of adenosine receptor upregulation and a relative drop in dopamine baseline, since caffeine temporarily enhances dopamine effectiveness. And the fifth mistake is thinking that coffee is dehydrating. This is a common misconception. We know that coffee and caffeine have a mild diuretic effect, meaning they can slightly increase urine production. So if you drink 1 cup of coffee, you may urinate a bit more later. But overall, coffee intake is still considered hydrating. You still receive fluid, hydration, water balance support from it. Even after waking up, coffee contributes to daily hydration, although for the ideal situation, after overnight dehydration, it is better to drink water first, and then you can have coffee. So water is the best option, but the second best is coffee. You still get hydration despite the diuretic effect, because this effect is very mild, very weak, especially in people who are already adapted to caffeine and consume it regularly. And now to summarize what we should know about coffee. First, up to 4 cups of coffee per day is considered safe for most healthy adults. Second, which coffee contains how much caffeine? The lowest caffeine content is usually in instant coffee and a single espresso shot, around 70 to 80 milligrams. Filtered coffee and boiled coffee, like Turkish coffee, are typically higher in caffeine, often the highest per serving. Is coffee healthy overall? Yes. If you consume around 2 to 4 cups per day, it is generally healthy and can improve health outcomes in a measurable way. Does coffee raise blood pressure? Yes. But the increase is usually minimal, short-term, and much smaller in habitual users, especially long-term. Does coffee cause anxiety? At high doses, yes. Usually above 300 to 400 milligrams per day. It can increase anxiety in about 50% of people. Coffee burn fat? Yes. Caffeine increases fat oxidation by roughly 15%, and this effect lasts for several hours. Is coffee addictive? It can cause mild dependence, but not severe physiological addiction. Does coffee affect the heart? Moderate intake is safe for most people and does not increase major cardiovascular risk, but high consumption can increase palpitations. Is coffee bad for the stomach? It can worsen acid reflux in about 30% of people who already have gastric acidity or reflux. Does coffee affect hormones? Yes, it can temporarily increase cortisol, but this effect becomes smaller with regular use. Can coffee improve mood? Yes. It can improve mood by enhancing dopamine signaling in about 70% of people, which is why many feel better, more motivated, more positive. Can coffee cause headache? Yes, especially during withdrawal when someone stops intake. But sometimes caffeine can also relieve headaches. And here is an important final point. Is coffee safe for children? And what about pregnancy and breastfeeding? For children, regular caffeine intake is generally not recommended, especially under about 12 to 14 years, because their nervous system is more sensitive, sleep is more easily disrupted, and anxiety or heart rate increases are more likely. Small amounts are not dangerous, but routine intake is discouraged. During pregnancy, moderate caffeine intake is usually considered safe up to about 200 milligrams per day, roughly 1 small to 2 cups, because higher intake may be associated with lower birth weight and sleep disturbance. During breastfeeding, small to moderate caffeine intake is generally safe, but high amounts can make the infant more irritable or disrupt sleep, since caffeine passes into breast milk in small amounts.